Very good afternoon. My name is Hashim Sarkis. I'm the Dean of the School of Architecture and Planning here, and here on stage to moderate and introduce the speakers of the first panel. I just wanted to take a moment to thank John Oxendorf for doing all the great organizing work and yet crediting me for being a co-organizer. And also thank him for the intellectual complicity that led us all to this event. In recommendation number 15 of the 2014 report called The Future of MIT Education, which for all the reports I've read, I have to tell you, it's probably one of the most ambitious and beautifully written reports that I've ever read. There is a call for establishing a thinking group to imagine the future of learning and living at MIT. The recommendation reads, and I quote, "The task force recommends that the Institute establish a working group on spaces for future student life and learning to bring together stakeholders from around campus to envision, plan, and create spaces for the future of MIT campus." Since the Future of Education report was written, its goals have been further elaborated towards what Chancellor Barnhart has outlined regarding ambitions to connect with the community through learning and education, ambitions to expand on innovation as a dimension of learning, and challenges that the Institute has put in front of itself about the future of our sustainability goals and challenges. All of these goals have direct implications on the future of the campus. But inversely, the campus has a major impact on how we live together, how we teach, and how we conduct research. I would like to think of this event as a step towards realizing recommendation 15. But we are also taking several steps in parallel. At the School of Architecture and Planning, we are launching a research group that looks at the future of learning spaces, universities and schools, working with cities, universities, and schools around the world on real-world experiments, but also looking at MIT as both our perpetual experiment and enabling laboratory. At the school, we have also started a learning initiative led by Media Lab professor Mitch Resnick that looks at the future of how design and the arts are taught, and conversely, how the design and aesthetic dimensions of our environment affect teaching. We talk very little about the aesthetic dimension of our environment. I hope we talk more about it after this conference. All of this is strongly linked to the larger learning initiative defined by the MIT Future of Education report. Moving to this afternoon's panel, and as a way of helping us gather material and knowledge towards tomorrow's discussion about the future, we have gathered a stellar cast of individuals whose experiences will help us learn from a series of past and present examples about how similar challenges were met historically and in the recent past. I am going to be introducing the speakers one by one, but mindful of the limited amount of time that we have, given that we are 5 speakers, I want to apologize for our inability to take questions here, but I also want to encourage you to approach the speakers at the coffee break afterwards to share with them your experiences or if you have any questions there. We begin our panel this afternoon with our own campus and with Professor Mark Jarzombek from MIT. Mark is professor of the history and theory of architecture at MIT. Among his many contributions to architectural history, he has published several leading books, including A Global History of Architecture and Architecture of First Societies, A Global Perspective. Mark is really a leader in the world of architecture history in rethinking radically how we think about other cultures and write their histories, but also how to expand the understanding of the global to be much more inclusive and equitable across the world. Through edX, Mark has also taught the first ever MOOC on the history of architecture with 25,000 people registering and 5,500 active participants worldwide. It is among the most successful courses taught on the edX platform to date. Mark is also author of the monograph, Designing MIT, Bosworth's New Tech, and today he will be sharing with us his reflections on the original design of the 1916 Cambridge campus, which we are celebrating today. Mark.
Thanks, Hashim, for the introduction. It's sort of rare to have a conference and celebrate 100 years of a building. I looked onto Google, I said, 100-year celebrations of buildings. And you get, some funny things, some palaces or Versailles or something like that, and then you put, 100 years academic buildings, and it's like, this is it. This is the first. So it sort of says something, I think, about this building. It also reflects a type of awareness that we have, growing awareness about the value of the building and the value of the campus in this historical sense and how it's going to shape perhaps the future. I'm not sure how I do this with the slide business. Do I just say, next slide? I don't see anything in front of me. Maybe I'll do this. Oh, okay. Maybe that's, all right. There's a saying that architecture is your destiny. And even though that depends a little bit on what you mean by architecture and a little bit, of course, what you mean by destiny, it's probably fair to say that this little phrase could apply to MIT in a particular way. President Reif just last night gave a very eloquent talk at the McDermott Award ceremony about the value of the campus and about the old group in particular in shaping the ideas of MIT. And I think we are sort of slowly beginning to realize that this building, though we've tended to just sort of use it as we might an instrument, is actually somewhat more complicated than that, and has built a certain consciousness that we all are going to appreciate over time. What I wanted to do today is just do a very quick and somewhat arbitrary little walkthrough to point through a few things that may not be so well known about this, but I think help shape very perhaps subterraneanly the culture that we have here at MIT. So here we are. When you leave this building, you're going to see this grand edifice on 77 Mass Ave. What do I do? Next. Okay. And I want you to sort of take an oblique view here across this and look at the stairs, and you see there's two sets of stairs. One set, the lower one, has a slight curve to it. And then you get up to a little landing, and then there's a straight part. And I want you to think about that curve very deeply. And of course, then if you do what I do is you start measuring it out. We're at MIT, of course. Next slide. And you realize here, next. There's the curve going across, and then you realize it goes somewhere. Next slide. There's very subtle indeed. Most people will, of course, completely miss the point. Next slide. Well, it says its center, which is the lobby 10. So when you sort of step on that very first step of granite, you are sort of already on, in some sense, in a hovering disk. 3 inches or 4 inches over the ground, which sort of propels you towards the center of the campus. In a sort of radiational, centripetal way, Bosworth already was able to sort of connect you to the principle of the Great Dome at the core of his design. A complete and brilliant, genius of a move. So, next slide. So, remember the little red line. Then we go up. Next slide, please. And of course, you see this edifice, which you walk through, in your career probably hundreds of times. And I just want to focus, if I could, on the Capitol, which you'll sort of see up there. Next slide. And Capitol is a replica of the Temple of Priene, which is which is a Greek temple now in Turkey. Next slide. And you can go, of course, into the third floor, and you can sort of see the Capitol sort of up close. They're absolutely tremendous, beautiful. And next slide, you'll sort of see they overlap completely with the original, which is taken from the Temple of Athena. Now, of course, Bosworth is thinking about what am I going to use as the model for learning? And Athena, of course, seems to be a relatively obvious choice. So nothing particularly, to say, innovative there, except, of course, we have to see this as sort of entering into the temple dedicated to learning and knowledge. But it doesn't quite sort of end there. Next slide, please. Do I have something here? Oh, okay. All right. So then we go into the porch, and you see this. And now, if you're a classicist, which I'm not, but I'm saying if you were, you would sort of take note, because Bosworth is something which is highly illegal. And I'm not talking about that sort of ugly potted plant from Home Depot, which is sort of I mean, I love this place, right? I mean, there's precisely this sort of strange incongruities between the beautiful and the absurd. Now, they put it out for you guys, as to celebrate. But I have a video here now. If you could just please work with me through this short little video. So we're entering this, and just play attention. Okay, opening the door. Oh, you got it. I heard that, right? Now, I bet you've gone through that door 100 times if you never looked at that. All right, it's fluted on the outside and unfluted on the inside. The flutes are these vertical striations. And if you know anything about ionic columns, you know they're always fluted. And of course, on the outside, they're fluted. And I show you here a typical ionic column with the flutes and ionic things, and that you would find out on the outside. And then you go on the inside, and oh my gosh, there's unfluted. Now, there's not a single Greek temple with unfluted ionic. There's not a single Roman temple with unfluted ionic. What was Bosworth doing here? So you get a section that looks like this, which is unique in the history of architecture. Period. There's nothing like this exists. Well, what Bosworth was, I think, doing, I mean, Bosworth was a very smart man, and he didn't do this, because of just accident. And clearly, when you walk inside this space, he's trying to tell you something. The flutes, in some sense, aren't necessary anymore. We've got to get down to work. We don't have time for the flutes. Maybe when we figure out all the problems of the world and we're done, we can call the contractors and they can flute it. So basically, he gave us this sort of unfinished look, like to just come out of the quarry. It was a mistake, right? A classicist would say this is a big mistake. But for MIT, this was exactly the message he wanted to sort of give us, right? The sort of the unfinished look, right? We'll figure it out a little bit later down the line. So it was complete genius of how he, in some sense, tried to invest in this incredibly subtle way, a type of logic that only we at MIT could understand, or not, depending on how subtle one looked at these things. Now, of course, he wanted statues of Praxiteles and Aristotle and Archimedes to be on the great plinths. But when after it was all done and MIT ran out of money, they said, well, we're not paying for that. So much for the arts in those days, I guess. But fine, I can live with that, because it's sort of the empty plinths I think we all have enjoyed as being, in some sense, also part of the narrative of that sort of the unfinishedness of Lobby 7, that maybe one day we'll figure it out, but maybe never. And the whole point about MIT is we're working on it. Then, of course, we go through this grand space, one of the grandest spaces in Cambridge and Boston for sure, and we come to this portal. And we enter the infinite corridor with its hung ceiling and its Home Depot neon lights and black and white paint. It's best, that's it, buddy. Pink, rose, brown. No. It's just black and white. We don't have time to dilly-dally with some sort of aesthetic here. And you enter the great infinite corridor with its sort of austere, simple, Home Depot illumination. But we know that there's more to it than that. And of course, the progenitor behind us was Mr. Freeman. Mr. Freeman was an engineer, a civil engineer. He taught a few courses here, but he was not a professor. He was a member of the board, a member of the MIT's corporation, and he would later go on to be one of the lead engineers of the Panama Canal. So he was a big shot in the engineering world. He specialized in concrete and fireproofing and the like. When the project was being sort of discussed at MIT, 1911 or so, he produced a study that I published in my book. You can read it in there. Which he sort of went to Europe and went to various places to look at buildings that he thought would be great models. And among them were buildings like this, the ETH in Zurich, which was designed in the mid-19th century, so 50 years earlier. Now, these are buildings paid for by the state government. And so if you're a faculty member at the ETH, the corporation would be the state government, if you will, and your tenure would be signed on by the president of the country. So these are state institutions. So they could afford these giant buildings, right? No one had ever attempted anything like this, of course, in Europe. And he made these studies, the comparative studies of all the European great models, the TU in Munich, the TU in Berlin, the one in Switzerland, and he put them on these wonderful plans. And he said, this is what we're going to do at MIT. But nothing like this had ever been done at MIT, sort of a grand mega building. No one had never thought about making a mega building for an academic environment. He particularly loved the corridors because that's how these mega buildings sort of functioned on their interiors. This is not MIT, this is a corridor from one of the TUs in Europe. And these corridors, however, had a unique ideological reality that people already then understood. And I'm just sort of quoting here from the local newspaper in Zurich. When a visitor walks through the corridors of the two universities in Zurich, he could, at least from the speech that he hears, not know in what country he is. So this is 1885. So the academic corridor was a type of a compression zone of reality, right? It brought people together. It was what we in the field today might call a social condenser. And this is something that Freeman sort of understood and appreciated. And so the Infinite Corridor is also a squeezing corridor. It's a place of where we can meet the Chancellor, the President, students, tourists, colleagues, and a place for linear discussions. Of course, we can pack it with people, or we can go at 2 in the morning and maybe somewhat less populated. But it's clearly designed as a social condenser, and for that, Freeman really is sort of the key person. And his building had, in some sense, this sort of choretic pulse that went through it. The other aspect that he brought to bear on it was his devotion to concrete. Concrete was a material that more or less had been forgotten through the Middle Ages and been only brought back in the late 19th century in various places. And in the early 20th century was experimented with, but still a relatively untested material, but it had the advantage of being fireproof. And Freeman thought this was very important for a laboratory building where a lot of dangerous chemicals and fire things could go up. So he wanted this thing to be in concrete. And eventually what we got was the concrete building, the biggest concrete building in the world at the time. And you could sort of see the framework of it. And if you look at it today and you think, well, if they had just put glass around it, this would be the most modern building ever in the history of the world, right? We'd be looking at this like we'd be looking at the Bauhaus, right? People would be coming to Cambridge and photographing this, right? But in those days, they didn't put glass in between the concrete columns. They put classical things. So we don't see the modern in this, right? We don't see it really at all. And he made this plan, which he said, well, this is, if I were a graduate from Harvard, this is what I would make as my Harvard model, which is a lot of little buildings. You know, the chemistry building, the physics building, this building, to that building. Everybody gets their little buildings, which he said this is not MIT. MIT is not about little buildings in the landscape. We want this mega thing. So his project was for this sort of mega thing with laboratories in the center, the corridor connecting around. And if we think of this plan is sort of in 1912 and so forth, 1911, and we look at basically what Corbusier, who was one of the great architects, modern architects of the time, was thinking about, right? Theorizing, right? So this is Corbusier's drawing that he makes of a building of flat concrete slabs and columns, right? And he was theorizing this in 1914, right? Well, we didn't need to theorize this. We were building it here. It's just that we covered it. Whereas Corbusier said, let's cover it with other materials, right? So, okay. But there is a modernity in this building. This is quite beautiful. But the most striking thing about it was, he said the inner organization of this building is open-ended and up for discussion and negotiation. So you see how he wrote the program for this in diagonally, so that it's not very clear where civil engineering starts and where engineering ends, or geology and so forth like that. It's left open. And the interior has no walls. The interior was completely a wall-less environment. Now, we all know that that's sort of not true. And over time, walls get built, and my office, you know, we tried to renovate our offices a few years ago. It took us 6 years of negotiating to move a wall, you know, because they stopped building the walls out of thin wood like he wanted and build them now then out of concrete block, which was, you know, okay, maybe it's a little bit of a mistake. But you can sort of see that his idea that universities, and especially MIT, is going to be in a changing academic landscape. We're going to decide which departments grow and which don't. They also wanted light into the building. So the building was 18 feet high. I mean, it's astonishing height. And he made these wonderful windows, which hardly ever one sees anymore. But you got to remember, this is what buildings looked like in those days. Up here in the school that will not be mentioned, this is what a science building would have looked like. Brick and wood, fire hazard and brick, and rickety old windows that you maybe come up and will fall down and whatever it is. These windows, I can't even get into, don't even get me started on the beauty engineering genius that was produced for these custom-made windows that you can sort of see in the great Lobby 10 on the view out towards Boston. Beautifully restored at great expense. The ceiling was analyzed, the colors, and so Bosworth's original colors put back. And congratulate MIT on that effort. And then Bosworth, of course, imagined this sort of the casing of this in this large sort of edifice, grand and noble, sitting on the Charles River, and basically taking control of the whole environment. At the center of it was this beautiful space, the library, which was modeled on the Pantheon in Rome. It's an exact half copy model, but not exactly. There's some changes that he made to here and to there to things, but basically it's exactly 50% proportional. The only thing he added in particular was this glowing globe that you can sort of see in the center, this sort of solar origin of all knowledge that was supposed to radiate out across the MIT campus. That, I don't think, was ever built, and certainly when they did the glorious restoration a few years ago, never put in the sun back in. But maybe one day we'll get a donor who can do that. But $3.5 million later, I think is what it cost, and a very wonderful donor who contributed to the success of this fantastic restitution of this dome. We have it back. It had been painted over, as you probably know, in World War II, afraid that the German bombers would use it as a beacon on their way to bomb the East Coast. And then once you paint over something, it's like you couldn't scrape it off anymore without damaging it. So it was just more or less left abandoned. There was a hung ceiling in there. There were, when I came in the 90s, there were still parking garage lights in there, I mean, because it was so dark. So anyway, we have it returned. And then I want all of you to go down on your hands and knees, please, when you go there, and look across the front of the porch. And you'll notice that the columns aren't lined up. They bow slowly to the sides. And Bosworth, being the astute classicist that he was, noticed that this was a phenomena of the Pantheon in Rome, which is his model. So he took that idea and applied it to the front of our school, so you can sort of see the different dimensions. And it's written into the construction drawings. The construction drawing says very clearly there's a bow, and it says 7 inches. That turns out to be a little bit less than 7, but I mean, okay, American contractors. But you could sort of see the edges are further back than the front. And the purpose, of course, is very clear. He was afraid that if you had the edge columns would look like they're falling off optically if they're all completely dimensioned. By putting them back a little bit, there's an optical effect of closure and of squeezing a little bit so that they look perfectly aligned, when in reality they're actually not. So he was very studious about the optical effect of this and realized this is what was going on at the Pantheon. Now, if you also look at the Pantheon, you notice a very clear thing, that even though this is modeled on the Pantheon, where's the dome? You don't see the dome in the Pantheon, right, from the outside, right? It's very low and built into the system. And this is not what Bosworth wanted. Bosworth said, Pantheon, schmantheon, I want to see the damn thing. And so he built it up on this enormous drum, and he made a model out of plaster that had a crank in it, and he could turn the crank, and the dome would go up and down. And a picture of him sort of like doing that, because he wanted it to be seen from Boston. He wanted it to be seen from below, and not just sort of be disappeared, because it was, in some sense, the icon of the Institute. Later, the Great Courtyard, where he had planned a big statue of Athena, designed by Paul Manship, that sort of also never came to be, and the courtyard was turned into a grass wonderland. And trees were planted there. And it was probably good that the dome was this high, because apparently no one in MIT has pruning shears. And you see, poor Archimedes, you can barely see him now squeeze out of the foliage. And the trees get taller and taller. But you see, there were some trees, but they were supposed to be kept very low. And I'm not against trees, don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm happy that we have our trees, but there's something beautiful about the nakedness of this building proclaiming itself on the landscape that we should sort of recognize. Even though today it's much more arboreal in nature, look like something you might find in Vermont or whatever. But the building survives nonetheless. We've drilled holes in it. I mean, imagine drilling a hole like this in the Stata Center. I mean, it already has holes, so I mean, it doesn't really matter. But I mean, the guys were jackhammering this hole, outside of my office. I mean, this is 8-inch solid concrete. This isn't going anywhere. No problem. You want a hole? Okay. Imagine doing this to the Stata Center. Oh, you want a pipe? No problem. I got all sorts of pipes in my office. I don't know where they go with all sorts of levers. I mean, it's really tempting. Like, what happens? Like, oh, don't worry, I won't do that. But it's like really, the red levers, purple levers, orange levers, all above my desk. I'm trying to figure out what it is. Yeah, and we could paint the window shut. This is my window. You can't open it. Solid, rusted solid, because no one oiled it for 100 years. And yes, we can plant little trees in front of the famous loggia and the Pantheon dome, because we all know that soon to be big trees, we won't see the thing. Yeah. But we all know that we love the building. And we all know that the building will survive all of these attacks. And we all know that in the last certainly I would say the 5 to 10 years, we've developed a new appreciation for this building that I think is driving us today to sort of rethink it as the core energizer of the campus and beyond. But it is a building that is not easy to particularly understand, because most of it we've forgotten. We're not classicists anymore. We're moderns. We don't know how to read Corinthian capitals, fluted, unfluted. This is all stuff that's forgotten. And in the 1950s, there was a letter to the president by a dean at the time, who remained nameless, saying that the lobby of the Rogers Lobby, buildings 77 Mass Ave, should be torn down because it was an embarrassment. It was classical, and we should tear it down and put in glass and steel. Well, maybe he would have done a good job, I don't know. But thank God it didn't happen, I would say, not because I want to honor particularly the classical project, but because the building is thoroughly modern already. It didn't need to be made modern retroactively in the 50s. It was modern from the start. It was a hybridic, it was interdisciplinary. You had engineers and architects doing their best and really taking the best from each one. It had subtexts and messages that a sophisticated architect would understand, but it also is a building that you could just do what you wanted to do with. It withstood a huge amount of abuse and lasted 100 years. It's highly unlikely that we're going to be here 92 years from now and celebrate the Gehry building as 100 years old. Not that I don't like it, I like the Gehry building a lot, but buildings today aren't designed for 100 years of neglect. They're designed for 30 years of attention, close attention, right? Between the rubber and the detailing, all of these things are very precious and need to be maintained continuously. So we have here an astonishing building, and one that indeed, as Raphael says, sort of has determined sort of the robust character of the MIT ethos, thinking through itself continuously, and will always sort of remain at the core of our heart. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Mark. Just want to let you know that next month, this book will be out. It's a book that Mark helped initiate, written by Douglas Shad Tucci, which is a campus guide to MIT from the Bosworth building all the way to the Stata Center. So much for my aesthetic question. It seems like at MIT, aesthetics are left outside the door. The fluting, and then inside is all function. It's actually a big pleasure to introduce Hilary Ballon, from a professor of the history, theory and criticism of architecture at MIT to a graduate of the program. Hilary is professor of urban studies and architecture at NYU and is deputy vice chancellor of NYU Abu Dhabi, a founding member of the team that actually began planning NYU Abu Dhabi in September 2007. She has been involved in all aspects of the new university, with particular emphasis on the design of a new globally oriented curriculum and of the campuses in downtown Abu Dhabi and on Saadiyat Island. A frequent traveler to Abu Dhabi, Hilary is based in New York, where her priority is to build an organic connection between the NYU campus there and in Abu Dhabi. And as the day today and tomorrow progress, we'll see the relationships between international campuses and virtual campuses developing and becoming more complicated. In addition to her administrative duties, Balan teaches courses on urbanism and architecture at the Robert Wagner Graduate School of Public Service. I remember meeting Hilary a while back during a lecture she gave about the work of Henry IV in Paris and the role that the institutional campuses that he designed and built had on the shaping of the city of Paris. I would like to add that Hilary has also worked a lot on Robert Moses and his work and impact on New York, of the larger projects there, and I look forward to hearing how her own hand and her own contributions of campus planning have helped shape Abu Dhabi.
Thank you very much, Hashim and John, for the invitation. And I hope I won't disappoint you, Hashim, but I'm actually not going to speak about Abu Dhabi. My task is a little bit different. Picture that column that Mark spoke so wonderfully about, and using the blank column on the interior as a metaphor for the work of making knowledge in the university. You can also think of it as a metaphor for the process of city building. Cities are always in the making, and what I'm going to do in the short period of time allocated to me is to describe the relationship between the campus and the city as it's evolved over 100 years. And I use these words, precinct, project, anchor, as my hooks, my framing terms to describe 3 stages in the evolution of that relationship. You know that the word campus is derived from the Latin for field, and that countrified aspect of the university, which I think informs the growth of the trees in the courtyard that Mark referred to, is a dominant image that we have with university campuses. But the fact is that universities are urban institutions. Today, 68% of higher education institutions are located in cities, 68%. And more than half of the students in postgraduate study are studying in cities. So the university is fundamentally an urban institution, and that is very important to keep in mind because in America we have kind of anti-urban association with the paradigm of the campus. So the first model, the first paradigm is captured in the word precinct. When in the late 19th century, university campuses were conceived of as places apart from the city. The city, the industrial city, was growing fast, and the university campus was carving out a protected zone where the commercial city could not implicate itself in the workings of the university. The university could be a place of contemplation and reflection, protected from the grasp of the city. And that ideal of learning, of the proverbial ivory tower, was captured in the physical form of the campus that you see exemplified here in Columbia's campus by McKim, Mead, and White, where an enclave is created that keeps the city at bay on its perimeter and creates a protected space within, organized around a series of quadrangles where that countrified aspect is captured in the open spaces, the lawns, and the landscaping. So you can see that protected interior space in this slide, and it is connected with drawing a sharp boundary around the campus that distinguishes the place within from the city without. This will often manifest itself in gates, as you see here, and there are obviously familiar examples down the road, and also in the change in the architecture and the language of the campus. So you are very much aware of when you are stepping onto the campus or from campus entering the city, when you cross this threshold. And the wall of buildings along Broadway that you see in the left really marks this concept of the university having a sharp boundary differentiating the internal space of the campus from the external space of the city. One of the achievements of this approach is the forging of a sense of community for the university. These courtyards become important social gathering places, places to learn. And one of the great wonders, I think, of our campuses are the way landscape and the interstitial spaces outside classrooms become wonderful places of learning and interconnection, like the corridors that Mark mentioned. So creating a sense of identity is a very important need of the institution and of student life. But how that is positioned in relation to presence in the city is one of the tensions that is played out over the next century. The next model is captured for me in the word project, or urban renewal project. By mid-century, the city had grown up around our urban universities, and in many cases, the city was seen as being destructive of the well-being of our universities. And the university was called upon as a rescue agent programmatically to think about the city's ills, the decline of the urban decline, and what policies and initiatives could be developed to help remedy urban decline. And this converged with two other elements of urban policy at mid-century. One was the rise of urban renewal with its preferred strategy of slum clearance. And the second was the rise of the democratization of higher education and the rising enrollment, rising number of students attending universities. And what this led to, these forces led to, was a plan to locate cities not where land was available on the outskirts, but to find inner city locations so that the university could better serve the surrounding metropolis, better think about the urban policies, provide better access to these newly expanding student bodies. But with in an already developed urban environment, where would these land parcels, the sizable acreage be found? And this is where the strategy of slum clearance, became crucial for the expansion of universities at mid-century. And over 50 universities greatly expanded or were built anew through this strategy of slum clearance. And I show you just a couple of examples now. First, the University of Illinois, as it was originally called, at Chicago Circle, but now the University of Illinois at Chicago, was sited on a site designated by the city for clearance because it was a slum. And what you see is in the plan, you can see the distinction between the large scale of the campus design and the smaller scale of the urban fabric adjacent to it. And it was that kind of urban fabric which was removed in order to make way for the university campus. And you see a construction photograph on the right. This is a familiar image to the architectural and urban historians in the audience, an iconic image of Mies van der Rohe's design for the Illinois Institute of Technology, somewhat earlier than the University of Illinois at Chicago, and really the paradigm for the idea of clearing an inner city site in order to give rise to a new concept of the university. And what this image really underscores is that even when there was a programmatic interest in the problems of the city, the campus design was still conceived of as a place apart, disconnected from the surrounding urban fabric. So it isn't necessarily the case that there is a complete alignment between learning goals or between policy interests and the physical character of the university. And this phase of the university campus as an urban renewal project, I think, embodies this disjunction. Because another example of university outreach at this moment is that government funding, federal funding, became available in the 1960s and 1970s for students to do community-based work. And what we now call service learning or community-based learning began to arise at this very moment in order to foster connections between the work on campus and the needs of the surrounding community. And now this is one of the common features of undergraduate programs across the country, service learning, and one of the outreach measures, one of the bridge building measures between the university research and teaching and the cities that surround us. But the birth moment is at this stage when universities are paradoxically wiping out urban fabric and at the same time beginning to recognize the importance of their missions in relation to the surrounding communities. The president of the Illinois Institute of Technology, after initiating this campus, left Chicago and came to New York City. And it was realizing the opportunity that urban renewal presented for university expansion, proceeded to do the same in New York City for NYU. NYU's main undergraduate campus was in the Bronx at a McKim-Mead and White campus, which was extremely handsome. But seeing the opportunity through urban renewal in the 60s, NYU was able to take advantage of an expansion opportunity. And what you see in the slide on the left is Washington Square in the lower right-hand corner of that photograph. Perhaps you can see the arch. And the area outlined in red is the area that was designated for clearance. And that land, not all at once, but over time, became the property of NYU. And it is what enabled NYU to make Washington Square and Greenwich Village its home base, its campus. And eventually, when hard times struck, NYU was forced to sell its Uptown Bronx campus. And it was able to do so fundamentally because urban renewal had enabled it to acquire all of this territory in Greenwich Village. And what happened was the 9 city blocks that you see outlined in the diagram in the middle were fused together in order to create 3 super blocks. And I'm going to come back to those super blocks in just a moment. So university as urban renewal project recognizes important connections with the city, but it's not translated into the physical form of the campus, which still remains apart from the surrounding city, which is seen to a certain extent as a danger to the well-being of the university. Over time, that boundary is eroded. And even these campuses that were built as enclaves, as places apart, begin to find measures that cross the boundary and bring the city within the campus. And I think that this project by REM Coolhouse embodies this effort to reconnect the inward-looking campus with the city. This is a campus center building, a student center building at the Illinois Institute of Technology, which you saw a moment ago. And as you can see, it incorporates an elevated subway station. And so the city is really brought right into the heart of the campus. For some, raising a question of institutional identity. And all of these connections between the city and the campus do cause certain parties to wonder if the distinctiveness of the university, if the sense of community, if the space of retreat needed for certain kinds of research are compromised or put at risk by the openness, the permeability to the city around it. But this brings us to the third and present phase that I'd like to talk about, the university as anchoring institution in the city. In this, I think now ascendant model, it's recognized that the university and the city are interdependent. And there are quite a number of factors, both pedagogical models, research models, financial factors, political factors outside the university, that I think all drive us toward this new paradigm of the university as urban anchor in a city. First, cities recognize that universities play a critical role in their economy. They're typically one of the very biggest employers in the cities where they're located. They own substantial amounts of real estate, and they are stable long-term presences. Campuses aren't likely to move. That's a sunk cost, and it fosters a partnership between the city and the university. Cities are also increasingly realizing, and this is certainly the case here, that universities create just the kind of talent that cities in this new knowledge economy need to thrive. So as great incubators of talent that can then support a thriving city, this is another reason to bring together the university and the city. And then the nature of the civic elite has been transformed over the last 50 years. There was a time in our cities where the leaders of the top businesses formed a civic elite that contributed to the great institutions of that city. That is typically not the case any longer. And in the gap, I think universities play an increasingly important role as a new kind of civic elite, looking out for the best interests of their city, or at least contributing to the advancement of their city. And I think that awareness is captured in the organization that whose website homepage is pictured on the left, although I don't suppose you can readily read the name of it. This is the Coalition of Urban Serving Universities. It was formed in 2007, and it comprises the heads of 43 public universities that are based on city. And this homepage explains the issues on which this coalition of public serving universities focuses. It is local economic development, public health, and K-12 public school improvements, all of which these university heads see as critical to the well-being of their urban situated universities. Another factor that contributes to this anchor paradigm is the funding structure for universities. As federal funding, as government funding increasingly declines, the private sector funding or non-governmental funding becomes all the more important, motivating universities to work more closely with industry, with the private sector in their environs. And on top of this, we have now new models of learning, the rise of service learning, of field work, the recognition of the value of applied work in the undergraduate classroom, as well as, of course, in laboratories and so forth. This is deemed all the more valuable, or more valuable, I would say, than ever before. And that fosters the kinds of partnerships and interaction with a city that I do think manifests itself in new forms of campus planning, new forms of campus design. Well, I am not speaking now about newly established universities, but universities that are seeking to expand in landlocked situations. And it is rare these days for the strategy of clearance to be available to a university. I think a rare exception is the Columbia expansion on the Manhattanville site, which was made possible largely through eminent domain of a few sites and the purchase of land that was deemed underutilized, industrialized, and the university was able to purchase. And the area that was cleared is what you see in the aerial view on the left. What you see on the right is their plan, and though you cannot, from a distance, demarcate the individual buildings, the main point that this slide conveys is that unlike the late 19th century campus that I showed you earlier, which closed off the city streets, the Manhattan grid, in order to create that place apart, the streets penetrate this area, and the buildings are situated around the grid with the city running through it. And this plan specifically calls out all the public open spaces that are contained within this campus to foster the interpenetration of the city into this new Manhattanville campus. So the strategy of renewal, or of clearance rather, is largely unavailable now. But even when it is achieved, you can see, I hope, that this is a different concept of the campus, different from the renewal models that I showed you earlier, which still seek to keep the university apart from the city itself. Where there was once a boundary, the boundary is eroded here. And this is the slide that calls out the public space and the photograph of the campus, whose construction is now rather far along. In densifying landlocked sites, the solution for expansion has been to build on what you have. And this is a strategy that NYU is now using in its significant expansion. Those 3 super blocks that I showed you a moment ago, those are the sites that the university is now planning for the next generation of its building. And what you see on the left are the 3 towers by I.M. Pei, closely related to your I.M. Pei tower, parenthetically, creating a considerable amount of open space that the university, now with city approval, is building in. And the plan on the right begins to show you the ambition, which won't be realized for several decades, I imagine, to build more and more structures in the open space that the urban renewal paradigm had presented earlier. And I'll close. I see the signal. I'll close with your very own project at Kendall Square, because I think it is the perfect exemplar of this paradigm of the university as anchor urban institution in relating to a new model of the campus, where the boundary has become completely transformed into a place of intersection between the university functions and other functions. And this vision of Kendall Square brings university spaces, housing MIT Museum, MIT Labs, faculty offices in very close proximity in the same buildings with private uses. And that, I think, is the place where we now will see universities moving as they think about their relationship with the city. How do these interpenetrations at the edges of the campus foster not only new models for sustaining the needs of the university to expand in developed cities, but also how does it foster new modes of research and learning from the city itself? Thank you.
Hilary, thank you very much for putting in front of us a rich array of examples and precedents, but also for helping us categorize them and think about the way they relate to their context and cities. I think this is going to be very helpful for us tomorrow. We are here to celebrate the 100th anniversary of MIT, but we are also here to celebrate David Adjaye. David is the recipient last night of the McDermott Award in the Arts at MIT. And thanks to the McDermott Award, we were able to have David here. David is very difficult to catch. He's always on the run. So let me introduce David to the audience today. He's principal and founder of Adjaye Associates based in London and New York. David was born in Tanzania to parents from Ghana. And in the year 2000, he founded his office and immediately won several prestigious commissions, including in Oslo, the Nobel Peace Center in the shell of a disused railway station, which was completed in 2005. And in London, the design for Whitechapel Idea Store, which really pioneered a new approach to the provision of information services. That was also completed in 2005. Adjaye Associates now has offices in London, Berlin, New York, Accra, and Shanghai, which is why he's difficult to catch, and is working throughout the world on the clock. It's like the British Empire, almost. The sun never sets on your office. One of his last completed projects is the Moscow School of Management in Skolkovo, 2010, and current projects include the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., which is soon to be completed. A lot has been said yesterday about David's work, particularly his strong commitment to high-quality design and the reflection on the connection between art and architecture. But what I would like to emphasize is the civic dimension of your work, David. I remember in 2005 getting a tour from you of the newly completed Idea Store, and that very simple gesture of lifting the curtain wall up and over the sidewalk and making that overlap between the city and the building so open and permeable, so inclusive, was a really moving experience for me. And since then, to many of my students who have and continue to strive to emulate that gesture of civicness. So without further ado, David Adjaye.
Hello, it's very nice to be in this incredible room and to be talking to you about campus. The project that I want to share with you it's probably on the other side, it's literally on the other side of the planet. It's in Moscow, and I guess the reason for it is that because it really looks at this notion of the campus, but presents a new paradigm in a different context, a different cultural context, and a different geographic context, and really tries to understand or foster from the lessons of other models a new paradigm that's specific for the agenda that was set. It's a project that we won an international competition to build as Hashim said, the Moscow School of Management, and it's called Skolkovo. It was really part of Medvedev when he had a sort of interim presidency between Putin's two sort of political runs, was this idea of creating a kind of much more open, forward-looking Russia, which would engage with Asia, engage with Europe in a new way, engage with the world, and would create a campus which would start to foster a kind of new sense of sort of identity and a sense of cultural specificity in terms of the training of the management class of the generations that were coming up in Russia at that time. So an incredibly interesting and forward and bold initiative, a political one, but one which allowed a kind of an incredible amount of experimentation. This area called Skolkovo is still designed as a place where it's seen as a sort of the tech corridor, the sort of their version of California, and it is a sort of a special place that is incubating new projects and new experiments to do with education and teaching. What's really interesting is that Skolkovo is in collaboration with MIT, so it's not as far as you think. There's a lot of thinking that's being shared, especially now on the science and technology project, which is being led by Hertog and Demuran. So there's been an incredible sort of a fertile sort of dialogue between institutions about what is the nature of learning and where are we now. So a little bit about I mean, these are just giving you the sense of the sponsors and the people that were involved. But let me just talk to you about how this project has come about, and I think that it'll be self-explanatory as we go through it. The site is here. This is the center of Moscow, where the Kremlin is. This is the Moscow River, and the yellow shows you the sort of basic plan of the kind of organization, the infrastructural organization of the city, which is these incredible radial sort of routes and sort of radiating panoptic routes that come from the Kremlin, which are these massive infrastructure routes, which are kind of allows the Red Army to radiate out if need be. That's how it was designed, but creates this extraordinary urban footprint on a plan, which is not different to many medieval plans. This idea of a kind of, Milan is very similar, but a much reduced version. And the site, which I showed you in the corner, is this incredible piece of land. It's a 27-acre site, sort of at the edge of sort of urban-suburban sprawl and sort of development, but near a very important cemetery for the city, and this sort of a moment where there's a kind of stream that comes off the Moscow River, which feeds into the communities, and creates this sort of very interesting sort of landscape in a dense city like Moscow, a landscape sort of area which is very much valued by the communities and by the residents who live in this area. Some of the things that we always do, apart from understanding the urban grain, in this instance, the urban grain was not so much the issue in terms of the fact that we had such a kind of huge sort of landscape site, but also understanding the nature of the going back to the fundamentals, which is the nature of the place and it's the way in which climate fundamentally imprints on the nature of a place and the way in which it operates. So not to always kind of presume that technology resolves the kind of relationship to nature, but to return back to a scenario where you're not trying to use technology to kind of create an artifice against nature, but to try and create an architecture where the architecture is in a kind of balance that kind of uses the minimum as it can to kind of create the conditions that the program requires. And this is a kind of constant concern in the work. The site is very tranquil, very peaceful, incredible flora and fauna, incredible wildlife. And this is for about, if you look, if any of you know this sort of diagram, it shows you that essentially it's like this for about 3.5, 4 months, and then it's like this for the rest. So that's the reality of the condition that actually, in spite of the urban grid and the kind of our ability to create, cities and to sort of urbanized places, the reality is that nature is still this profound element that we sometimes negotiate in very kind of unfortunate ways. So the building, but the project is to create a campus, and a campus is a very large kind of agglomeration of a lot of people coming together. So it is a kind of it is in its nature about bringing a lot of artifice into a kind of condition, which is this beautiful sort of piece of nature. And so we sort of started to look back at, how has this happened? And, we've heard examples of how urban campuses have come about. But in a way, for us, it was to return back to the notion of where were the first kind of places of learning and the clustering of people selected from, communities that were kind of already sort of protected from the world by the nature of, creating cities. And, the monastery was really the first model, I guess. And this is looking at England and Yorkshire and, the incredible abbeys that were in Europe, that were, centers of learning, and really were these extraordinary sort of clusters of chambers of different parts that kind of would surround themselves around a quad and a campus, and would create kind of connections either to the landscape to deal with, getting to the water for power, or for, literally to get water for the community, et cetera, and would create a kind of incredible network that was condensed, controllable, but really about a special group that were being trained. And this model really is the model that has really been influencing a lot of models of what the idea of the kind of place of learning becomes, and this idea of the kind of respite and the refuge. And you look to Oxford and Cambridge, which are some of the quintessential sort of archetypes of that kind of evolution from that Gothic or sort of medieval beginning, which is actually also a classical beginning. It can go back to right back to the sort of religious structures that were built and places of sort of secret learning right to Egypt. But in a way, we're talking about it becoming these kind of places where the Enlightenment sort of is starting in the medieval ages and becomes the places that become the colleges where the Enlightenment, as we understand it now, explodes. And Oxford and Cambridge maybe exemplify that moment where there's a kind of an expansion, where it's much more open. It's not about the select group, but it's about bringing in the elite in society and educating them to lead the world. And you have the American version for that. I mean, and I'm jumping, there's so many variations in that, but then you have the American version, which, Jefferson eloquently plays out, and lays out this idea in the sense of the notion of the campus. This is a beautiful plan where the campus is really the sort of rectangle field in a beautiful pastoral landscape, and it has its central building and body spines with a series of academic buildings which sort of line a central space, but is really kind of connected to nature and becomes this bucolic, sort of idyllic sort of retreat. And then you move to, a model that I like to use, which is the 20th century, and you look at East Anglia University in England. I'm sorry, I'm probably being very English-centric in the way that you're American-centric. But in East Anglia post-war, there's this attempt to create a modernist idea of the campus. And it's the idea of using big architecture to create signature buildings, but also to use modernism and brutalism to create these new superstructures that creates an architecture that's not based on the quad, but the idea of a new street. So the move away from the quad to a street as a strategy, which then allows buildings to be lined along it, and then a kind of new community to be inserted into a piece of landscape which can have museums. This is the Sainsbury Centre, et cetera, by Norman Foster, or other sort of special buildings that kind of create the enlivened new community, which is a sort of an armature connected to a city or a community. And obviously your project, which you know very well, so I don't need to speak about it, but the notion of MIT and the project that I don't need to talk about it, you understand it, the campus building, which is connected to the urban environment but creates its own environments as well, but is in this kind of dialogue and dialectic with the city. But we're in Russia, so there's also this incredible precedent and relationship that I think is a kind of, what I call a kind of academic collective memory of this incredible place, which is building mostly neoclassical buildings now as a kind of the model of an aesthetic. And when we won the competition, we said, you have this extraordinary history of kind of an enlightenment about modernity and about new construction, a sort of lightness, an ability to try and create new hybridities that were really the sort of germ spark of modernism. And you know, that we felt that there was something in that work that really needed to be, at the beginning of the 21st century, explored as a potential, especially in this competition. And there were very few examples built. Melnikov's little studio, which is a tiny, tiny project, but incredibly powerful in terms of the way it organizes and works space. It's basically two interlocking circles that kind of organize work and life and living space, and orientates itself to the light very specifically to create studios or sort of large glazed views, is a very instructional project. But moving right through to Ledenov and Melnikov and the suprematists, and looking at the extraordinary projects which were happening at the turn of the century in this part of the world, which were really very powerful, had a powerful influence. So we said that it seemed that we should learn from this, and also learn from the kind of extraordinary work of Melnikov, Malevich, who talked about the idea of creating a new disaggregation through understanding aerial photography and the way in which it kind of gives a sort of new perspective, the way in which technology can allow us to look at things differently and reconfigure our world in a different way because of the new optics. In a way, the classical language is kind of born from a kind of human eye view. It's really about the way the sort of 1.5 meter eye line perceives and understands proportion and perspective and systems, but how technology can shift that, and that with the lens of technology, we can shift what we sort of understand about the world and how that is communicated. I sort of always argue that, you know, you may think you're looking at sort of primitivism when you look at African architecture or artifacts, but you're looking at a kind of radical use of sort of materials that are available around you, and an extraordinary abstraction to create relationships and scales and send messages about narratives about the universe, the world, the notion of community, the notion of weaving and bonding, which I'm deeply inspired by. And I put this as a kind of way to counter the way in which the imagery about the continent is sometimes presented. And then also, we also looked at this notion of the urbanism, the urban grid of Moscow, and this idea of the sort of densification that happens right up to the 19th century, and the sort of building of the Kremlin with its sort of picturesque towers and sort of palaces, giant palaces, which gets to the extreme of constructability, but have a kind of picturesque sort of reference image to the past, and to Brezhnev post-war, the sort of super blocks that were developed by a kind of whole generation of engineers and architects to house the Red Army, one of the largest armies in the world, when it came back from World War II and had to be quickly sort of given homes for the great work for liberating the world at that time with the Allies. So we sort of said, okay, can we think about all this? So I put that all in the background because that's what we were processing. So you have that in your background. And can we think about a kind of new way of using the site? And with the sort of environmental issues and the kind of context in mind, we thought, what is the smallest footprint we can make for this entire complex? And we worked, that in the end, we sort of aggregated a form which was 1,000 meters, almost square, 1,000 feet square. And then we looked at all the components that, and that's really looking at the school, the relationship with the different parts of the school and the way in which it interacts. And then we looked at the other components that add to that, which were a residential component. You know, this building was to have about 200 residences on site. It was to have conferencing facilities, which was a way to kind of cross-program the pure academic work of the building with the outside world, because this building is set apart a little bit from the main part of the city. It was the idea of bringing a sort of a different program into the university to bring the outside world, because in a way learning is no longer just coming from the academic world, but it's also coming from entrepreneurs and industry, people who are working in garages or in warehouses. So this idea that somehow the research is happening in very polyphonous ways and you can somehow laminate them and bring them into the campus was something that was to be encouraged. And then, you know, there was a hotel and a sort of luxury hotel put in this, and everybody was asking at that time, why do we need it? And it was also to talk about the notion of leaders who disconnect from schools, and to talk about the ability to bring them back into schools and to have the kind of, you know, the comfort that they need, but also to kind of create relationships where students can interact with this body in a new way. And so what we suggested was that all should mix. And instead of making a campus or a Jeffersonian campus or a monastery, that we would make a vertical campus. So a kind of vertical structure that was a hybrid that would compress the experiences and create almost like your infinite corridor, a kind of new rub that would be about the adjacencies of vertical life in this context. And the reason for that verticality and that compression was to create a kind of as much a sort of sustainable footprint that would allow us to use the least amount of infrastructure building and energy to create the smallest but densest community on this very large 27-acre site. The idea being that it reverses the notion of creating a world inside. It becomes an object like a supremacist constructivist construction that looks to the world outside as its inspiration. So, and essentially, with most of these projects, these constructivist projects, it's this notion of the orientation and the light and the kind of the dynamism of the form. So the components, this idea of the disk of learning is elevated above ground. You come in, the entrances are in there, and then there are these forms up above. And the organization for the forms in this blank site, for me, became about simply reflecting the light. So it became about creating almost a compass, a way to understand nature in terms of sunrise and sunset, and to understand the way in which the orientation and the quality of light in that context would work. So the buildings are basically organized as these bars, residence and hotel, administrative building north, and then the west as a kind of respite building, end of the day, which is the pool, the gym, et cetera, et cetera. The disc, the 1,000-foot disc, is organized as a series of, almost like a clock, a series of chambers which bifurcate the cylinder and create spaces for light to always kind of, as it were, pierce the disc, and then a north-facing conference center, which obviously has the best light for exhibition and not having direct solar glare. This was the form in its context, so this is the compression, and it sort of sits with a series of ramps that sit onto the landscape, creating a kind of a sort of very strong planned form. I'll quickly go through the plans because there's no need to go through it in detail, but essentially the immediacy of the arrival is taken through a sort of a series of stations, sort of general arrival, which students can kind of park, and bicycles and et cetera are here, a VIP arrival, which is obviously drop-offs from your private cars, and then back-of-house facilities are all here. And then the school, which has this extraordinary form where you have the sort of southern and northern exposures here, and the different teaching labs that cluster with a sort of 3,000-seater auditorium here and a smaller 500-seater auditorium here, and the kind of central area being the communal facilities, the canteen facilities and the sort of the luncheon community facilities. And then up above it, you see the campus, the sort of the residential building here, which is a double-loaded corridor unit, the hotel, the five-star hotel, the Pleasure West building in the northern pavilion, which is the library, administrative functions, et cetera. And they're all connected through the cores into these programs and go right down to the ground. So there's this kind of this sort of way in which they are in or out of the system. The whole construction was about, because it was such a large form that we didn't need to pilot, we could literally rest it like a sort of super tanker. So we basically developed a sort of 3-meter slab that allowed it to float, just sit, and because of the size of it, we didn't need to pilot to anchor it, it just sort of suspends in the soil. And then we try to achieve these extraordinary cantilevers first in steel, and every Western engineer who just thinks about economics first before viability was thinking it had to be steel, it had to be steel, it had to be steel, and actually in the end it was too expensive and too complex. There was too much steel required to create the structure, and then we worked with some retired Russian engineers who actually came in and saved the project because it literally was going to go off budget. And they basically proposed that the entire building was made as a moment frame structure with, you'll see the cantilevers in a second, and it was extraordinary. It sort of halved the budget, and it was a kind of very easy and sustainable way for us to kind of make the project. The big move is the idea of the campus as one single 1,000-meter plane with the life of what would be your infinite corridor, but now is a loop. So there's never an end to this infinite corridor. It's a system that is continually almost returning back to a cloister, creating a kind of network, a circular system that keeps going around. The orientation is the light, because you go from not seeing the light to when you see the light, and that becomes the device where everybody from the classrooms are moving into this center and moving around, and either going into the core for communal issues, sustenance and kind of things like that, or returning into the threshold spaces, returning into interstitial spaces, waiting for classes or lectures, and then going into these classrooms. And then the auditorium in this sort of northern sector here, and then the black boxes being the cores and stairs that take you up into the system. This is a kind of very large, it's a 650,000 square foot building. So we designed the exteriors and all the forms. These are these concrete shells that we set up, that structurally set up the disc. This is a 30-foot high room. And then the interiors were all given to a lot of interior designers and teams. We had one insistence that the floor of this chamber had to be made of white Carrara marble, and the ceiling had to be slatted timber open so that all the services were accessible. So two materials, and then go for it, do what you want. This is the organization which I described, so the way in which you come in and arrive, this is the school, and the way in which the residence connects straight to that, and the sort of the Western sort of pleasure building, as I call it, is sort of connected to that life. The blue is the conference center and the hotel, and sort of VIP, and the green is the kind of administrative scenario. This is the building and its context. So this is in that sort of typical winter where you approach the building, and this is looking from the west. The building is also then a sort of essay. At that sort of time, it was about the way in which digital technology had allowed us to really move away from the industrialization. This is the way in which the industrial revolution and kind of standardized materials and shapes, which people like Eames had talked about. This panelization, which is completely gone. There is no need to follow that kind of standardization anymore. Efficiencies are created in computers in terms of geometry and shape. So I could create a tiling system for the entire building. The building is concrete, but it's clad with different types of glass. So glass is no longer just a transparent material, but a cladding material that really talks about being a way to create the waterproofing membrane, but also to speak about the orientation of light. So we talked about the notion of making these super blocks that are floating above this building in different colors of glass. So sort of a warmer, sort of neutral color for the north, a sort of morning blue for the east-facing blocks, and then the golden west on the rear. And it's this fractalizing of the glass so that you lose the sort of modernist ribbon of like 3 stripes, but actually but it is there if you squint, but it is this idea that it's broken and that the individual sort of expression is articulated in this sort of pixelating of the system. So this is when you get closer, and you see these are 130-foot cantilevers, which are done with these concrete frames with no bracing. So it's just the kind of intensifying of the moment frame to create the rigidity. And the buildings are almost 500 feet and rise on 2 cores. They're like bridges that float above this form. And the idea is that this becomes the belvedere, the elevated garden for this community. So there's one world which is the world outside, and there's another world which is the world between the buildings and interconnected. I like this image only because I found out during the project that actually Malevich is buried here. So in a very, I always like to show this image as my little thing with Malevich. This is in the spring, looking at the way in which the light sort of comes to the building, and this field, which becomes the sort of landscape for the students. It really becomes a kind of new sort of respite, and the approaches, depending on the elevation of being able to go up into the building and the form, either by ramp or stairs, or in the winter when it's heavily snowing, to be able to kind of come underneath the sort of structure to get straight in. And then the interiors, which we also did these lobbies, the main sort of entry lobbies we did with these black ceilings and sort of a sort of dark travertine floor. And then you come up into the white and timber ceilings, and then you go into the spaces. We also did the auditorium. We did a few things in there, but not all of things. The auditorium is this timber-clad sort of redwood, sort of Russian redwood-clad chamber with these very large skylights, which sort of retract and allow daylight in or not, which kind of allows the entire school to assemble and sort of hear presentations, etc. This is how we sort of left the sort of main sort of loop of the sort of the circuit that goes around. We call these clouds because they're sort of huge skylights with about sort of 10-foot cavities that diffuse the light and drop them down. And then people were, this is a kind of image now where there's a kind of bustle in between the program areas where people just relax, surf, sort of you meet professors, you're doing what you need to do and interconnecting and creating that kind of informal quality that's incredibly precious in sort of this kind of school. Canteens, this is again the interior is done by these other interior designers, but this idea that there's a kind of transparency and a permeability between different groups. The gap between each sort of school and this idea of being able to see the world between these and these places where depending on where the light hits, shafts of light coming deep into the plan. And then the classrooms, these large cells that are in between the schools with the sort of different areas, and the flexibility being able to shut them down into smaller units or larger units. Teaching is obviously by Wi-Fi, and it's about a kind of much more kind of dialogue-based teaching rather than table and chair sort of teaching in the sort of traditional sense. It's more arena-like sort of. And then just looking at the way in which the building kind of creates this world day and night for the community. And you can see these are the residences, so when people are in, you see the windows light up. And that's the way in which you see that expression. And then the hotel, which was done by a different team, but you sort of get an idea of what's going on. So this is a kind of hotel space with its cafeterias, crazy corridors, sort of rooms, and you can see the sort of window expressions that are in here. And then when we were developing the pool for the project, we realized that actually the Russian Olympic swimming team were very close and had a very poor pool, not a kind of good sort of state-of-the-art pool. And so the university, the center kind of collaborated to create an Olympic-size training pool, which allows the Olympic team to train here. So now there are these swimming clubs that have kind of developed with students and these Olympic trainers who are sort of also then co-mixing. This mixing is happening with a different, the idea of the kind of highest athletes and with, working with their body are also brought into the building. And there's a kind of transparency at this level which looks to the city. And then there are spas in this place. So in the building there, this is not my design, but it's the spaces where, there are spas and then there's this chamber that we developed above the pool, which is a sports hall that allows different games and configurations to be made, and then gymnasiums, et cetera, to look through that. But this, remembering the inspiration of Melnikov, this idea of a kind of dynamic sort of inheritance that they had in this superstructure sort of form to create these chambers. And then this is the roof terrace, this is a sort of close-up where you're looking at the colliding of the forms. So the administrative building with its cooler blues, the sort of the residence building and the sort of works building at the end, and then the way in which the light plays on this idea of the sky and then refracted light in the space. Then looking at it head on. Originally, I had a building for the staff, but they really didn't want to be in this compression. We were trying to get them on, but the staff insisted that they wanted to be away from this to have respite. So in the tradition of sort of country buildings in Moscow, we built them little cottages. So the staff were in a very traditional compound, not wanting to be in the mix, which was a compromise, but we decided to give them, you know, these sort of cottages that looked back towards the form. And then the administration building with its, you know, this is the director's own furnishings, and he sent us this picture when he did it, the boardroom, et cetera, and the way in which the kind of, you can see how the facade and the system works. And then the graduation, which is, you know, they used the pattern of my building throughout the uniform and the graduation elements. So the whole thing becomes a kind of unified whole. Thank you.
David, thank you very much. Around David's residency here with the McDermott Award, we've been fortunate to have him be a kind of catalyst on different themes that are of current interest to us, but also to him, and use his experience to guide us through these different themes. Last month, we had a very interesting panel on the future of the library. Today, the future of the campus. And on April 28, 2016, we will be having a panel on the future of the museum, benefiting from his experience with museums. Our next speaker is Christian Veddeler, who's director at UNStudio, where he leads several international projects, currently including mixed-use high-rise projects in the US and in Germany. In close collaboration with partner Ben van Berkel, Veddeler was in charge of the design for the campus of the Singapore University of Technology and Design, which was completed in 2015, and it is going to be the subject of his presentation today. His extensive involvement in academia includes numerous teaching assignments, among them Harvard University, Technical University in Delft, and the AA Visiting School. If, as Mark showed us, MIT was the groundbreaking institution of research and teaching in 1916, many of the MIT faculty visiting in Singapore and working there attest to how that new campus is the model for the 2016 Teaching and Research Institute.
Thank you for the introduction. I will indeed try to stay within the time limit. It's relatively short, and once an architect talks, this goes for me in particular, then it might take for ages, but I will try to really focus on the time frame that is given. I want to talk today in a general term about knowledge spaces, and those knowledge spaces I would like to relate directly to the project that just was mentioned, Singapore University of Technology and Design, that recently has been opened. This is important to mention, of course, in collaboration with MIT. The project we have won as a competition in collaboration with DPA from Singapore in 2010. It is from scratch. It was on a land that was not used and was finished in a very short amount of time of 4.5 years, which I think says a lot also about the Asian ambition and the Asian pace to realize projects. I've broken down the ideas or more impressions of ideas that were guiding the design, that were guiding the project, very briefly, and I will break it down into 10 items. 10 seems to be a good balanced number to make sure that the ideas are completely communicated. The master plan, to start with a big scale, non-linear space as discussed. What you can see here basically is an aerial view of this entire site, which is close to Changi Airport, so a little bit of the outskirts of the city. And basically the project is generated in 2 phases. And phase 1 is what we have realized. This is this part you can see here. Phase 2 is about to come in a hopefully near future, which has a lot to do with the amount of students that are going to subscribe to the programs. I will focus mainly on the academic part of the educational program of the university. Next to it, you can see the residential units for the students, sport facilities, a gym, a swimming pool, outdoor sport facilities. Having mentioned the idea of non-linear approach to organizing a master plan program, basically tries to focus on a network system, on an organized network system, as you can see in this axonometric view, that tries to break down this new campus into a pedestrian-friendly environment. But to avoid strict hierarchies that we normally know from also modernist master plans that we have seen, but to allow an endless loop of the most diverse trajectories of students, of faculty, of visitors, of staff in an endless continuous loop. And the idea is to introduce this on the ground floor level with this learning spine as we have defined it, with a living spine that's connecting to the northern part where the housing units are, and to do the same in a vertical manner to introduce the connection to the upper levels of the program within the building. Looks a little bit confusing, but the idea also here is not to give a linear approach to this is the route you have to take in order to meet your program you want to visit, but to allow a diversity of circulation throughout the buildings in order to encounter in order to encounter meeting of people and engagement of all the different people that use that campus. You see a little bit the scale of it. We have broken down the system into several nodes. Those nodes are in a distance of about 80 meters, which is around 240 feet. And the idea is basically here to break down the length, the scale into walkable distances that also you have to take into consideration. Singapore has a tropical climate that also with 80 degrees temperature is still pleasant to walk. The buildings as they are right now, you can see from the northern perspective of this learning spine of the housing facilities into the buildings. Those buildings over here, they still need to be continued in phase 2. They will have a topping on top of it. The same goes for this one, but phase 1 as that is complete and is organized by a high degree of density, which has to do with the land use in Singapore. Land is rare, so density has to be improved. Density has to be extremely high. With a height limitation. We are close to Changi Airport, as I said. That means we have height limitations. Those height limitations do not allow to make those buildings larger. Next to the fact that this density is reached, the buildings are also very close to one another, which also I will explain later, support also the idea of a climate, of a local climate that is not exposed to direct sunlight, but really is producing own shaded places that again help with the temperatures you can find there. Number 2, the learning spine, as mentioned before, the most important trajectory to combine and connect all learning programs. We designed it as a transition space, and this has a lot to do with the fact that we allow the exterior to become the interior, to make visible programs from the inside accessible from the outside. And instead of this manicured lawn that we find in so many reference projects, mainly of the past of universities, we embrace this idea that this is a tropical context. So we have a lush, very green landscape, which again helps to optimize the climate, to create a certain idea of shadow, and make this space also a very informal meeting space. So people, students, professors, faculty can come together and use those outdoor spaces, as we also have heard before, as outdoor informal meeting spaces, as outdoor classrooms. The transition is also given very much with a vertical transition, with a vertical development of that green, which is not so visible yet, because we have vertical planters on those facades. Within a couple of years, the facades also will start to become green. That means that this active, lively tropical green will take over the buildings. So the buildings, differently as indicated with the MIT building, can be camouflaged to a certain extent with the green. That the foreground, the background is in discussion, that the tropical context, as I said, that this nature context is going into one-to-one dialogue with a building. The learning spine, this is a drawing basically of this learning spine. Again, the idea here, it's not a linear trajectory connecting A to B on the shortest distance, but allows a meandering movement of the visitors, of the students, of the professors through that space, and basically is accompanied with that sort of green buffers. The most important thing, those areas, those porche spaces that are carved into the buildings, that means that the facades of that building on the ground floor and first floor level basically are permeable. That means that you can enter the building without having facades in front of you. That allows the interaction of those informal learning spaces with the specific spaces around our 550 lecture theater, for example, our 1,200 seat auditorium, much more accessible, and also negotiates the boundary between inside and outside once more. The gradient in that sense between interior and exterior is important. With this, we also generate daylight quality in the courtyards of the building and allow outside views into green tropical environments also from those programs. So transition, again, you can see this parts of the building. I will also explain this later with the facade principle. Parts of the buildings are open to allow the landscape to grow underneath. This again allows the easy exchange, reducing of thresholds from exterior, informal exterior, and the more formal programs that we have inside. The third aspect, the program, that means the function, the different functions that we have, multi-usable space. Also, we have, with that project, made an excursion here and have visited MIT and studied the building very well. We found some interesting topics that were mentioned today too. We don't know at this moment of time, and it would be quite arrogant to say so, we don't know how the academic models of the future are developing. That means if we now would generate a building that is fit for use right now, it might be obsolete in 5 or 10 years' time, because the academic programs, the educational models change so fast. The idea here is to allow change and adaptability. In order to do that, we have done something which we are quite proud of course, together with SUTD. We have looked intensely for ourselves into the setup of the new program, the setup of the curriculum, which also is established in collaboration with MIT. And what we see here are the main 4 pillars, the main 4 departments: architecture, product design, system design, and information design. And instead of articulating the need of 4 different schools with 4 separate buildings, we thought, also together with SUTD obviously, that it might be more interesting to think what kind of cross-relationships, multidisciplinary approaches could be. So we went into a very, very empirical overview to really understand the requirements of the program. What is important to say, when we won the competition in 2010, the school was not really there yet. A lot of head of pillars were not installed. We did not quite know what the program in particular would be, so also a certain degree of adaptability was necessary to be implemented there. And we had endless rounds of discussions with users, end users, with heads of pillars in order to understand what the requirements are, because at the end, head of pillars know much better what kind of requirements or spaces they have. To make a long story short, we looked into the overview of programs, certain percentages of what kind of programs would be required and what kind of functions there were, and we translated this into this abstract model. The interesting thing of this model, and I will not explain too many details, are that indeed we try not to install different schools in different buildings, but to allow proximity and exchange of programs throughout all buildings. That means that the biology lab can be next to the architecture studio, the cohort classroom, next to the fabrication lab. So this allows, I think, to support this idea of SUTD, of combined learning, of combining different students, especially in the first 3 terms, to be exposed to all of the programs that there are, in order to allow the exchange of ideas, exchange of people, and confrontation, literally confrontation of different interests, different needs throughout the program. In the relationship to the building, it means basically that we define a central campus center, which is the neutral heart of the school, which is used for events, for exhibition, for assemblies. We have key programs like the IDC, which has its counterpart here in Cambridge, the large-scale auditorium and the library, as extremely specific programs that have to have their space. But throughout those programs, basically we've introduced a quite flexible system of multiple corridors, all corridor, no corridor, here is an important aspect, and the possibility to install the programs from admin to the different classes, to the labs, to lecture theaters, to everything which is necessary in regards to the program in a flexible and adaptable manner. That in 10, 15, or 50 years' time, if programs need to grow, to shrink, to be adjusted, maybe those light walls, I don't know, they're not from wood, but they can be removed, can be adjusted in their position in order to allow the flexibility necessary. You see in the center part, the campus center, and you can see here the extension of phase 2. So right now we have a slightly asymmetric approach to the center. This has to do with the phasing of the project. In the northern part over here, you can see the first phase of support facilities. We have a lot of facilities there. We have the fabrication labs there, and the connection up to the north connects to the housing program of our neighbor. Circulation, all corridor, no corridor, I've mentioned that before. We think also that the circulation is a vital part of the academic program. It's not just a corridor connecting from one point to the other, having 2 closed doors on each side, and then hoping you find your goal. It's about much more. It's about organizing the entire campus. It's organizing the buildings. You can basically see here a principle of different hubs as we have defined them. We have a connecting bridge in the middle, main programs like the auditorium lobby, like our IDC staircase. We have 2 sky gardens, as we have called them, vertical transportation areas, transportation zones, and around this, different breakout areas, different co-lab zones that can be used by students for informal working groups. On top of this, within the buildings, a network of corridors, and those corridors do a similar thing as we have heard before. They are there to allow that people meet each other, that there are encounters, there is a possibility, again, of a diversity of routes through the building. That also means that we don't have any program that is remote in comparison to a center position, but is connected through all different means. The introduction of this idea of diagonal connection is found back in the floor plan. That are diagonal corridors that mainly are oriented in such a way to articulate that special program. Those breakout programs on the other side have a very clear visual connection, for example, in this situation, to the connecting bridge between the 2 buildings. So also wayfinding and orientation is supported by that. This connectivity, those diagonal spaces in plan and in section, are articulated on very many different levels. What you can see here is the roof of our campus center connecting with an uplifted bridge from our library space. And the idea also here is not only to create a shortcut, but to generate spaces that are to stay in, not just to move through. And at the same time, this outdoor, this garden, this landscape topic is introduced here as well. We have diagonal spaces in our sky gardens, as we have called them. They are centrally organized staircases. The idea is also that people do not use elevators so much. The elevators are slightly hidden in comparison to the staircases, because we think that around those staircases, again, encounter, meeting, and social event to a certain event can take place. There's also the possibility around those areas to have, again, collab areas where students would sit together to work in an informal way. I have to make one, I think, important note when I talk about liveliness, student life, and activity of the campus. Please forgive me that I only can show you photos at this moment before the building was fully occupied. That means that sort of liveliness you normally would expect from a significant amount of students is in most of our photos reduced to a few scale figures. So imagine hundreds of students occupying all those spaces. Talking about those diagonal connections, there is a secondary logic to it. which also will explain with the facades. We have a color principle. The interior courtyards are toned in purple tones, the exterior ones in green tones. And the organization of those vertical void spaces that we have introduced also help in the color coding that they use to negotiate between the inner corridor and outer facade areas, so they help to support the wayfinding principles. The facade as a display space might sound strange. A facade seems to be so two-dimensional. How can this become a space? The idea basically is that the facades in their articulation unveil a lot of the programs that are visible behind. The idea was also related to a tropical climate and also related to an idea of sustainability, to remove large parts of the facade from the building in order to allow open corridors. Those open corridors support, on the one side, the economic approach of the building. We just don't need glass facades over here. On the other side, they also help to control air conditioning needs. We have our classrooms on the opposite side of those open corridors, and the classrooms can be cooled individually. That means, depending on the amount of occupation, the time of occupation, we can switch on and off the classrooms for cooling, while the corridors are always open, are shaded and naturally ventilated. The open corridors, as we have described them also as streets in the sky, continue this idea of the circulation on the open campus, and on the other side, allow visibility of the program, visibility of the movement of students outside on these balcony areas. The facade, you can see a courtyard, inner courtyard over here, also unveils to a certain extent the program that is behind. We have the library facilities in this part. The elastic envelope of the facade can grow and shrink in order to enclose programs when necessary. The library needs more space, therefore it grows. At the same time, the negotiation between outdoor spaces with a water pool, with green, with a terrace of the library, a roof garden is introduced again. We have different facade principles that we think are very important to support this idea of visibility, of display, of the functions behind, and at the same time support this idea of sustainability. As I said before, we have those open corridors. Those open corridors are protected by louvers for rain and for access, direct daylight access. We have the integration of planters there to continue the horizontal green into a vertical green, but we also have the possibility for certain programs, for admin, for example, to bring the facades, to bring the glass facades directly to the perimeter of the edge. At the same time, we introduce a high degree of differentiation of the facade, which generates a nice play that we as architects, of course, like, but on the other side also supports this idea of readability of the programs behind. Readability of the programs behind and the activity of people walking on those open streets, connecting with the bridges that we have. So in projection, what we can see here basically are those streets in the sky. We see here an open section with a program behind. There are, let's say, some deeper porche spaces that connect either to the interior parts or to our sky gardens. We have GFRC panels used here. Those GFRC panels are extremely precise in their geometry, but also relatively light, but they can also support this idea of planters. And this display space, it's unveiling itself a little bit in the perspective, not in the elevation, where we really can see this plasticity of the facade, the articulation of the depth of our streets in the sky, of our corridors, in order to articulate the sort of open programs that we have here. And when we look into the inside of those facades, this is the exterior facade, entire programs are introduced. So we have the possibility of breakout areas, of collapse spaces, but at the same time also within the facade, within the open facade elements, circulation trajectories connecting, in this case, a few floors of collaboration programs together. The event space, extremely important to generate a heart of the campus and an address for the university, its students and faculty and staff to identify with. The center space is basically our campus center. And this campus center It's generated of 2 floors, first floor, second floor, directly related through glass facades with the interior space. And we have a classical multifunctional event space, an event hall that can be used for exhibitions, for gatherings, for meetings on a large scale, and is extremely flexible, it's extremely neutral in use. So also here the adaptability plays an important role. We have 2 large staircases, one connecting to the IDC, the International Design Center, the other one just not visible in this image, to our auditorium, to also directly use this central part again as a distributor to our specific programs that also are interesting for visitors and guests for easy orientation and wayfinding. You can see basically the floor plan. We have our learning spine here, the possibility of rigorously openable facades that are also used at nighttime to cool down the building with cross ventilation, but also to allow the possibility of a low threshold boundary between exterior and interior. We have those 2 staircases I mentioned before over here, and a neutrally usable functional event space in the middle. Important thing also here, this is the main address, the main entrance of the school. From here on, visitors, guests can be distributed through our circulation system through the rest of the program. Sustainability, an important aspect I've mentioned before. So green space, something which is really important. And with green space, we do not only mean the integration of landscape, which of course I've mentioned before, but also the approach to try to make a sustainable building on many different levels. The idea here is not to introduce sustainability as a gimmick or an add-on with technology that maybe right now is very interesting, but again, in 5 or 10 years' time will be obsolete. The idea we introduced here with sustainability was to start with passive tools. Passive tools meaning that the choice of the orientation of the building, the relationship of the mass of the building to each other allows optimization in regards of daylight, but at the same time avoids massive heat loads, for example. We have parts of the building that can be completely open. This is enabling air movement. That means we don't have to cool down the entire building, but have large parts that are open and seamlessly integrate with the landscape. And last but not least, extremely important aspect too, which I think should or almost comes with, I think, every state-of-the-art academic program, is that of high adaptability. That also means that the investment made in materials here with a CO2 footprint will hopefully be still usable in 50 or ideally in 100 years' time, like our MIT example shows. That also means that we don't have to tear down this building in order to build something new, but this is a building that is supposed to stay. Just a quick principle of, in particular, the relationship of the different building volumes to one another, which in this tropical climate helps to create shadow, to create, through openings, air movement, to avoid that sort of heat loads. And at the same time, you can see this here in a glimpse of a section, to allow very adaptable, very flexible floor plans to use. Social space, also, I think, more and more, one of the most vital keys of a university, of a campus environment. Breakout areas in particular. The idea is that people, that students, professors, that faculty, that staff can meet in an informal way. That student life is celebrated throughout the campus, that an address is generated where people affiliated with SUTD feel at home and understand this as their place to be. So in that sense, large sections of the campus allow for that sort of social mingling. We have not the Oxford table for the professors, but we have a very nice canteen and cafe, which is completely open and becomes also a central space for faculty and students to meet. It is open to the environment. It is very visible. It is again a low threshold. This is a place where people can meet again with an informal lunch or dinner. And the idea is basically, you can see this in here, that this boundary between interior and exterior is only indicated by a material differentiation. So we embrace again this idea of this tropical climate, support with a little bit of ventilation, but for the rest we keep it open to the environment. A shared space, we understand also consequences of new forms of learning, which has a lot to do with collaboration, with co-creation, and with sharing. So shared spaces for us become very important. You can see here the library, which is scarily empty. Again, this has to do with the fact that the pictures were taken at an early moment. The idea basically is also for the library space, which is one of the anchor programs of the school, that visibility, generation of a foreground, a background, a foreground, a middle ground, and a background become important, that people that work in those facilities are visible to others. So the idea is to generate a very lively environment of a shared space. At the same time, diagonal view connections are extremely important in order to anticipate also the different programs that are there. We don't want to separate that sort of program that goes on to 3 floors with vertical slabs, but we really want to generate those void spaces that allow visual connection throughout. They're also in unconventional spaces for students to work. That sort of sitting landscape, which is most of the time crowdedly occupied, people just sitting and reading and learning there. Yes. I will finish very quickly. So. Some learning booths that we have. So again, from the group learning to individual learning, different facilities are introduced over here. Last topic, collaboration space, and I keep it very short over here. There is this cohort classroom for the first 3 terms, which is a signature classroom for the school. It has a central area which is configurable. It has certain areas that are separated from this. So basically, that's the plan of a multi-configurable, multi-usable plan. In visualization, it looks like this. We have the back part, we have the front part, that different groups can work at the same time. And once reality is confused or confronted with this, let's say it like this, creative chaos takes place. And this is, I think, exactly how it's supposed to be. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christian. One last short presentation will be from Julie Newman, who's the director of the Office of Sustainability at MIT, bringing the discussion back home. Julie has worked in the field of sustainable development and campus sustainability for the past 20 years, and her work in research and teaching has focused on the intersection between decision-making processes and organizational behavior in institutions and bringing sustainability into higher education. Prior to joining us here at MIT, Julie held similar positions at Yale and Northeastern University. Please join me in welcoming Julie Newman.
Great, thank you, Hashim and John, for including me, the ability to contribute to this panel, so thank you. It's a great opportunity. Well, I have the honor of bringing this back to MIT now, where we started with Mark's earlier presentation. And I was invited to provide some insight and thoughts into the direction that the Institute is looking as we look ahead to the next century and as it relates to our recent commitment to becoming a sustainable campus, which has been referenced a number of times in the earlier discussions. In 1916, MIT, I do not believe, had yet hired a director of sustainability. And in fact, many campuses today are still defining this unique and unusual role. It's not to say, though, that sustainability in its earliest form was not being considered at the time that the Institute was moved and redeveloped on this site. And the original design principles, which Mark spoke of earlier, were architectural, they were social, intellectual in nature. And from what I've read, they also embody this integrated framework for wellness and efficiency. And I think we've heard a bit about that in the earlier discussion. And as we walk the halls of the main group, we are reminded of the historical roots of the MIT campus, and we get to experience these principles firsthand. And so as a new person to MIT, it's been, I find, being able to go back to the history is a wonderful way to actually connect to the culture of the place. And we can look back and you can revisit the manifestation of what Mark alluded to earlier of Bosworth's and Freeman's principles of design in the main group, as we've learned about today. If you look back in the corner here, you see where the placement of the power plant was as it relates to the railway. We can also look at systems and modes of transportation that were designed around the Institute at that time. We think of early systems of communication and as we were saying about the adaptability and what has changed since that period of time. And I think one of the most important and discussions that has continued over time is the assigned gross square footage of office space per occupant, which exists in all of our institutions. And our campuses reflect the very nature of this evolving context in which we live and work. And I often wish, and now being at a number of institutions, that the walls of our institutions could really talk. The takeaway, I think, as we look ahead, though, at the future, are the many conversations and decisions that we are grappling with today are the same as they were back then at the root level. So that is what I'll speak about today. But what is new is we have a new scientific understanding of and interest in our impacts from upstream to downstream to human health and environmental health. What is new is the use of and the access to technology, be it energy, communication, building systems, transportation. What is also new is the evolution of the location, again, as we've seen today, from the industrial with a more open space to a dense mixed-use urban environment here in Cambridge. And what also is new, which is where our position comes in, is the profound opportunity to embrace the synergy between the MIT educational and research mission to the manner in which we're managing our physical space and our campus operations. So we really begin to shift our view from these physical constructs and operational areas from needs to mission enablers. That's new now. This is the difference between shaping the campus in 1916, I believe, and now renewing the campus and expanding the campus in 2016. But before we look ahead, I just want to provide the current context in which our future at MIT is being shaped, and this was alluded to a bit earlier. Within 2.5 years of my arrival here at MIT, which was in 2013, the Institute had publicly announced a number of prominent commitments, each commitment representing MIT's leadership style for a changing world and thus an evolving campus. These commitments include MIT Nano, which is designed to support the activities of more than 2,000 MIT researchers. It's been designed as a world-class facility to modernize research capacity and deepen the collaboration between multiple disciplines. The Future of Education there was a Future of Education task force that again was mentioned earlier. They were charged with envisioning the future of the MIT education in 2020 and beyond, and concluded that the education will be characterized as more global in orientation and more modular and flexible locally and open to experiments with new modes of learning. The Innovation Initiative emerged, and if I encourage everyone, similar to looking at the Future of Education report, I encourage you to look at this one, because this report articulates that the Institute will reimagine an innovative centric campus that merges classrooms with makerspaces, create collaborative learning spaces in student communities, and employ state-of-the-art facilities to enable technological advances and solve a range of critical challenges. Now, outside of the walls of the Institute, but again, where we merge, as was alluded to by Hilary earlier, the city of Cambridge embarked upon this ambitious discussion with an extensive stakeholder engagement process to establish a pioneering path forward towards a net zero emissions future that puts Cambridge on the leading edge of innovation for sustainable cities. Again, this is all within 2.5 years, mind you. MIT and Cambridge share the challenge of how do we grow and prosper in a manner that supports a vibrant economy and community while decreasing greenhouse gas emissions. So in the fall of 2015, MIT publicly released two major documents. One was a plan for action, a plan for climate action, and the other released by our office called the Sustainability Working Group Recommendations, which was an integrated vision for our buildings, stormwater, landscape, and labs. And collectively, they outline a deeper commitment to sustainability and combating climate change, locally and globally, while leveraging MIT as a testbed for change. So the plan for action on climate calls upon a deepened understanding of climate change via scientific exploration, an expanded commitment to new research in energy technology and carbon reduction strategies, and the development of educational modules. And at the local level, the plan calls for the development of a climate action plan to address greenhouse gas reduction, mitigation, adaptation, and resiliency of the campus. Our interim commitment is to reduce our emissions by at least 32% by 2014 and eventually seek to achieve carbon neutrality. Now, similarly, our sustainability recommendations sought to place MIT on a path to align its campus operations along a core set of sustainability principles. And this path is intended to set a strong foundation for rigorous institute-wide goal setting, measurement, verification, and implementation strategies moving forward. And lastly, that I'm going to speak of today, is MIT has embarked upon and has committed to a robust capital renewal project to ensure that the buildings and physical plant of the campus continue to support the educational, research, and student life activities essential to the mission of the Institute today and into the future, while reducing deferred maintenance and as we know now, reduce our emissions. So now that these commitments and desires have been articulated, endorsed, and are public, we must grapple with what are the physical, financial, behavior, and organizational short and long-term manifestation of each of these commitments, both individually on their own and as a collective. And then the question that we face from my area of sustainability is, okay, how do these current commitments how does sustainability become an enabler of these goals and commitments and strengthen the desired outcomes, not something that we have to grapple with and be pushed aside? So the goal of achieving a sustainable university, I would argue, is a transformative one. It's got, with cultural implications that many instances require a paradigm shift, which has been alluded to as well today. MIT has the potential to profoundly impact the sustainability of our campus and in turn systems throughout the world. We are the size of a small city, contextualized within the infrastructure of a large urban environment. And we've positioned MIT with the launch of this office to ask ourselves, how can MIT become a game-changing force for campus sustainability in the 21st century? So I'm going to begin by just coming down from the systems to each of the areas, again, that we grappled with 100 years ago, and now how we're thinking about grappling with them today. So when building the campus in 1916, MIT was home to a state-of-the-art district steam and electric power plant powered by coal. Coal power was the central facility. At the time, it was perceived as cleaner. It was more efficient choice compared with the individual coal furnaces in campus buildings. And it was located appropriately next to the existing Grand Junction Railway to streamline the delivery of coal from the rail cars. And today, we're in a similar place and we're reevaluating our energy system. We have plans for renewal and expansion of our central utilities plant located in the same area. And today, we seek to align our energy needs, our energy generation, our distribution, and our building and energy demand in support of an ever-expanded mission, as mentioned earlier. And we're committed to an energy system that's right-sized to the natural resource constraints of a changing economy and climate and to the needs of a first-class research campus. How do we bring all of these pieces together? And how will we achieve our 2030 greenhouse gas emission goal and strive to become carbon neutral in time? What is the technology beyond the cogeneration bridge? And how might we replace natural gas down into the future? What will that be? And how do we integrate on-site renewable energy? These are the questions that we are now grappling with on the ground. Let me move to buildings. MIT's Cambridge campus was originally built on 50 acres of reclaimed land from the Charles River, and as noted earlier, now occupies 168 acres. These existing buildings account for 97% of MIT's greenhouse gas emissions when measuring scope 1 and 2, and require significant resources to maintain, to upkeep, and renew in time. And as MIT embarks on this aggressive capital renewal plan, its existing buildings pose significant opportunities to address the challenges of sustainability and deferred maintenance concurrently. MIT has a track record already of building to high-performance standards with notable projects such as Sloan or the Koch Institute, but our ambitious capital renewal plan and an institutional commitment to sustainability necessitate an even more strategic, innovative, and consistent approach to integrating sustainable high-performance practices across all of our building types moving forward, with particular interest in the old stock buildings. So a question that, again, we're grappling with on the ground is how ought we design for a low-carbon future? Moving to materials, we have to consider our inputs and outputs into the system. MIT relies on a wide range of goods and services to operate and carry out our educational mission. Actually, the Institute procures goods ranging from office supplies, food, computers, lab equipment, vehicles, and of course, construction materials. So the type, the quality, the quantity of commodities being procured have far-reaching implications far beyond the MIT borders, from companies and markets being supported by our purchases to the environmental and human health impacts of the product's manufacturing, use, and disposal. So on the ground, how do we quantify the urban metabolism of our campus, and what ought it be? Mobility, transportation choice is a manifestation of time, space, and movement for individuals. So MIT commuters make a choice on a daily basis as to how they intend to move to, from, and around campus, a choice all of you made today. So again, on the ground, as we look ahead, how do we optimize the connectivity of the urban mobility network and rethink the community's relationship with transportation? Stormwater and landscape. The MIT landscape plays a dual role, I would argue. It provides ecological services within an urban environment and may be framed as providing the natural infinite corridor, a term we don't tend to use. We will cut the trees a little bit lower though, Mark. If you will, that brings people and places together. And approximately 64% of MIT's landscape, however, is now composed of impervious surfaces, roof and paved surfaces. So the rain falling on these surfaces results in stormwater runoff that flow into the city system and eventually discharge into the Charles River, carrying various pollutants and potentially compromising the health of the watershed. So how do we configure the campus? How do we configure the land cover and land use impacts in response to the health of our ecosystems, to human health, and to the eventual impacts of climate change looking ahead? Data. Making informed decisions and recommendations about the future of sustainability on the MIT campus and surrounding community requires the availability of meaningful data and measured outcomes from a wide array of sources, as well as the ability to aggregate and analyze large volumes of data in a user-friendly, efficient, and secure manner. So we seek to develop new tools to facilitate easy access, querying capacity, and analysis of data that's relevant to our sustainability efforts moving forward. So what will our metrics be, metrics of success be, and impact be when we look back in 2050 and 2100? And the last piece for this discussion is the role of students. Again, not an operational area, but this is where the new opportunity comes in. We can now be bold and tie the physical and operational aspects of the campus to the learning outcomes of our students on our campus, and even to those accessing us digitally, leveraging the campus as a demonstration site with regards to its commitment to sustainability. And so now our role is to now look at these as individual areas and then understand what are the interactive systems implications as we look at the campus in its entirety. So how are we going to do this? This now leads me to this discussion of the approach that we've now set forth for MIT in terms of looking ahead. So we aim to transform MIT into this powerful model that generates new and proven ways of responding to the unprecedented challenges of a changing planet via operational excellence, education, research, and innovation on our campus. We seek a model that considers the scales of impact and all of the issues that MIT will continue to grapple with as a campus, be it climate change, materials management, transportation, food systems, all have implications at the individual, the campus, the city region, and the global level. So in conclusion, I would argue that MIT is well positioned to excel in a next generation approach to campus sustainability and is well positioned to reframe the next century. We have a collaborative fabric of researchers, entrepreneurs, inventors, community partners, alumni. We're poised to transform the campus and its surroundings into a scalable laboratory in which to devise, pilot, implement, and evaluate the sustainable urban strategies of today and the emerging next generation strategies for tomorrow. We must embrace and openly grapple with seemingly opposing challenges Time and budget, short and long term, crisis du jour versus planning for the future. We have this desire for connectivity and isolation with our office designs. We're local and global. We're simple and complex, and we embrace technology as paradox at times. These are all constructs that frame our daily decisions. 2, we must consider and define what it means to develop an adaptable, flexible, value-based model that supports and is more integral to the mission of the Institute. We've heard smatterings of this in the other talks. 3, we must come to terms with what the conditions for success are and how this might manifest itself within the current MIT culture. What kind of changes and adaptations do we need to make in our roles? And lastly, we must revisit the principles of connectivity set forth in the main group and now bring those early principles forward to tie together our ecological, our human, and our physical systems. I think that would be a fabulous discussion to have after today. And a shared vision of a sustainable institute really reflects the complexity, the abstraction, the depth and moral and ethical implications that sustainability purports. So in our efforts to demonstrate best practices in limiting carbon emissions, in decreasing environmental and human health impacts as a campus, we're exposing our students and engaging our staff who are full participants in this campus-wide effort and commitment, how to grapple with complex challenges and work across, at times, seemingly disparate disciplines, disparate functions and expectations. But we can do it. And that is the underlying challenge, and I would argue, our best opportunity at hand. Thank you.
I encourage you all to really engage with the speakers during the coffee break, which we will have right now, and reconvene in 20 minutes at 10:04. Thank you.